Some women carry silence the way others carry jewels, quietly, deliberately, and with a kind of sacred gravity. They have learned that there is a difference between speaking and being heard, between explaining and being understood. In the beginning, she was like most, restless in her needing to be known. She would shape her sentences carefully, trying to paint her softness in colors he could recognize. Each word was a seed she pressed into his soil, hoping something tender would grow between them. But his eyes were far away, somewhere behind the fog of his own inner world. In Jung's language, he was ruled by his animist projection, that restless energy of reason and defense, of logic and control. He could not yet see her, not truly. For in her words he saw only a mirror of his own noise. She explained because she longed to bridge that space. Because she thought understanding was the way love took root. Because she mistook her explaining for intimacy. But each explanation became a thread that bound her tighter to misunderstanding. He listened with his mind, not his soul. And so she found herself drained, a woman trying to reason her way into being felt. It is an ancient story, older than language itself. The feminine principle, that vast, intuitive ocean, trying to be measured by the masculine principle of thought and order. In her explaining, she unconsciously stepped into his world, abandoning her own. She left the temple of her silence and entered the court of his logic, believing it was safer there. But every time she did, she lost a fragment of her mystery. There is a peculiar ache that arises in the woman who over-explains. It is not the ache of being unheard, it is the ache of betraying one's own knowing. The ache of translating intuition into justification. In Jungian psychology, this is the moment when the ego tries to negotiate with the shadow, when the conscious self seeks validation from what lies outside, rather than reverence from within. Her ego believed that if she could just make him understand, he would stay. But understanding was never what he lacked, it was presence. And presence cannot be reasoned into existence. The silence came slowly at first. A pause between sentences. A quiet refusal to argue what she knew was already true. A subtle recognition that her words had become instruments of self-betrayal. And one morning, perhaps with coffee in hand, perhaps with tears that didn't quite fall, she simply stopped. Not out of bitterness, but because something ancient in her woke up. Something older than romance, older than her name. It was the archetypal feminine, the one Jung called the anima in her most sacred form, rising to remind her that her worth was not found in explanation, but in essence. From that moment, her silence was no longer emptiness. It became form. It became shape. It became power. There is a reason silence unnerves the unconscious masculine. He feels in it the echo of his own unintegrated parts. A woman who no longer explains mirrors to him the parts of himself he has not yet faced. Her stillness exposes his noise. Her calm reveals his restlessness. Her grounded self-possession becomes the mirror where his ego trembles. In that reflection, he begins to remember something buried, the sacred union of anima and animus, the balancing of intuition and intellect, of softness and structure. But this awakening does not happen immediately. At first, he may resist her silence. He may accuse her of distance, of arrogance, of coldness. He may push, provoke, or retreat, because in her silence, he feels the collapse of control. And yet, beneath that confusion, something stirs. He begins to think about her. Not because she spoke louder, but because she vanished from the noise. Her energy, once scattered in explaining, now gathers into magnetic presence. It is felt rather than heard. This is the paradox of feminine power. It is not in her effort, but in her being. The less she seeks to convince, the more she is felt. The less she performs understanding, the more she becomes unforgettable. In the quiet spaces between her words, she reclaims something the modern world has nearly forgotten, the sanctity of inner stillness. Jung wrote that the path to individuation, the full realization of the self, is a movement inward, a descent into one's own depths. For the feminine soul, that descent often begins when she withdraws her energy from explanation. It is not withdrawal from love, but from illusion. It is a turning away from the need to be validated by the external masculine, the father, the lover, the culture, and a return to the internal source of knowing. Her silence becomes her initiation. And slowly, the chaos inside her softens. The body relaxes. The mind unclenches. She begins to hear the subtle music beneath everything, that rhythm of life that does not rush, does not argue, does not prove. The pulse of nature itself. In that soundless symphony, she realizes that her energy was never meant to explain, it was meant to embody. He begins to feel it too, though he doesn't understand it yet. He starts to notice her absence like an echo in a once familiar room. The space she leaves behind becomes an alchemical chamber, where his projections, once comfortably mirrored by her defenses, now dissolve into awareness. In Jungian terms, this is the beginning of shadow confrontation. The man who once demanded explanation now finds himself face to face with his own unhealed parts. Her silence becomes the mirror through which he meets himself. That is the hidden beauty of the feminine who stops explaining. She no longer participates in the unconscious drama of validation and defense. She no longer fuels his avoidance. She no longer gives her life force to misunderstanding. Instead, she stands as the self, the axis of consciousness and unconscious, radiant in her wholeness. Her quiet becomes his teacher. And somewhere deep inside him, a small part of his soul begins to whisper. She was never angry. She was awake. But silence is not easy to hold. For centuries, women have been taught to fill it, with apologies, with justification, with sweetness. They have been trained to explain their boundaries so gently that the boundary disappears. To rationalize their intuition until it sounds logical enough to be believed. To stop explaining, then, is a rebellion of the deepest kind. It is the breaking of ancestral chains. It is the reclaiming of one's voice through the art of not using it. This is the paradox of individuation, the realization that to become whole, one must first step back from what fractures them. To find truth, one must stop trying to be understood by those who refuse to listen. In silence, she becomes vast. In stillness, she becomes undeniable. Her presence begins to speak in ways language never could, through the way she moves, through the steadiness of her gaze, through the quiet confidence that no longer seeks permission. It is in this quiet sovereignty that the world begins to orbit differently around her. Not because she demands it, but because her frequency has changed. She no longer radiates need, but essence. She no longer chases understanding, she is understanding. And those who once required her to explain suddenly find themselves at a loss for words. The feminine who stops explaining herself becomes like the moon. She does not compete with the sun, she does not justify her phases. She waxes and wanes, she appears and disappears, and in doing so, she teaches the world about rhythm, about mystery, about cycles. Her silence, like moonlight, is not absence, it is reflection. It illuminates without burning. It moves tides without speaking. It holds entire oceans in its pull. And just like the moon, she belongs to no one. There is a moment in every awakening when silence ceases to be absence, and becomes a mirror that shows not what is said, but what is meant. Not who the world believes she is, but who she has always been beneath the noise. For the woman who stops explaining herself, silence becomes the language of truth. It is the language of the body before words, the language of intuition before intellect. It is how the soul remembers what the mind forgot. In the old myths, the priestess never justified her wisdom. She spoke in symbols, in dreams, in half-answered riddles that forced others to listen differently. She knew that true understanding was not born of explanation, but of perception. The divine feminine speaks through presence, not persuasion. And so, when a modern woman withdraws her endless reasoning, she is not becoming cold, she is becoming sacred again. Her silence is not the end of connection, but the beginning of depth. When she stops explaining, something subtle begins to shift between her and the world. He feels it first, the man who once demanded reasons for every emotion, logic for every boundary. He senses that the energy has changed, that she no longer bends to fit his understanding. Her silence unsettles him, not because it is cruel, but because it is free. In Jungian language, her detachment disrupts his projection. He can no longer cast his shadow upon her, no longer make her carry the weight of his unhealed parts. She refuses the unconscious transaction. For a time, he resists. He tries to provoke her back into the familiar cycle. Accusations disguised as curiosity, questions meant not for truth but for control. Yet she remains unmoved. Her eyes become still water. Every word he throws toward her ripples, but does not sink, because she has stopped confusing explanation with intimacy. She no longer feeds the hungry ghost of misunderstanding. In this stillness, she begins to see herself differently. Her silence becomes a mirror too, one turned inward. She notices how often her body used to tense before explaining, how her breath would shorten, as if bracing for disbelief, how she performed reason to earn belonging. It is here that her shadow reveals itself, the part of her that equated love with approval, understanding with safety, being right with being worthy. Now she sits in the quiet and faces that shadow like a long-lost sister. She does not banish it. She simply watches. Because true transformation is not about killing what is dark, but integrating it. And as she accepts the parts of herself she once tried to justify, something extraordinary happens. She no longer needs the world to do it for her. This is individuation, the merging of the fragmented self, the return of lost pieces once given away through explanation. She begins to feel whole. There is a strange paradox here. The quieter she becomes, the more she is heard. The less she defends herself, the more others begin to listen. Not because she forces attention, but because her silence now carries the weight of consciousness. Her presence becomes the pause between heartbeats, the space in which others feel themselves more clearly. And he, the man once dulled by noise, begins to awaken to that space. He finds himself remembering her at odd hours, in the hum of the morning kettle, in the shadowed calm of late evening. He thinks of her not for what she said, but for what she didn't say. Her silence echoes louder than her voice ever could, because it is in silence that the psyche begins to project. Jung called it enantiodromia, the reversal of energy, the turning of opposites. Where once she overgave, now he overthinks. Where once she explained, now he imagines. Her silence becomes the canvas for his realization. And realization, unlike explanation, transforms. For the feminine soul, silence is not retreat, it is alchemy. It is how emotion becomes wisdom, how pain becomes power, how chaos becomes calm. In trauma psychology, there is a stage called integration, when the nervous system stops explaining itself to survive, and begins to feel safe enough to just exist. Her silence is this same nervous system's rebirth, a return to her natural rhythm. She no longer rushes to fill the gaps. She no longer fears the pause, because she knows that silence is not a void, it is a womb. Everything that grows, grows first in darkness and quiet. The archetypal feminine has always known this. In the ancient temples, women were not measured by how eloquently they spoke, but by how deeply they listened. The oracle at Delphi spoke rarely, but her words shook kings. The goddess Isis wept silently, and from those tears came rivers. Modern culture forgets this sacred polarity. It teaches women to explain, to market, to clarify, as though meaning is something you can force into being. But she, this awakened feminine, remembers that power does not explain itself. It is. And the more she embodies that stillness, the more magnetic she becomes. Not to manipulate, not to control, but because energy always moves toward what is grounded. He too begins to feel the pull. The man who once dismissed her now finds himself drawn back. Not out of conquest, but curiosity. What changed? He wonders. Why does she no longer reach? Why does her silence feel like gravity? He cannot name it, because it exists beyond reason. He only knows that in her quiet, he feels something sacred, something like truth. In the psychology of attraction, this is not a trick. It is resonance. Two energies finding their rightful balance. When she stopped explaining, she returned to her essence, the receptive, intuitive, feeling side of consciousness. When he encounters that essence, his own psyche begins to stir. The anima within him awakens, that inner feminine Jung described as man's connection to soul, emotion, and creativity. Her silence calls his anima forth. It does what her arguments never could, it moves him inward. Because no one awakens through being convinced. They awaken through being mirrored, through encountering what they cannot yet name, and feeling the ache of their own distance from it. Her silence becomes that mirror, and in its reflection, he begins the slow work of individuation too. But the deeper meaning of her silence is not found in him. It is found in her own evolution. The woman who no longer explains herself is no longer at war with reality. She trusts that what is meant to understand her will. She no longer negotiates her intuition to make others comfortable. She no longer defends her softness as though it were weakness. She has become the archetype of the self, integrated, whole, radiant in stillness. There is no longer tension in her boundaries. They exist naturally, like air around flame. Her presence teaches more than her words ever could. Children quiet around her. Men soften. Women remember themselves. She becomes not a performer of meaning, but a vessel of it. Still, there are moments when the old patterns whisper. The temptation to explain returns like a familiar ghost. But now she smiles. She knows the voice of the ghost. It is the echo of the girl who needed to be understood. She blesses her, then lets her rest. Because understanding is no longer her currency. Presence is. She knows now that real power does not shout or justify. It radiates. Like sunlight through leaves. Like still water holding the reflection of the sky. She knows that what she once feared, silence, was never emptiness. It was truth waiting to be remembered. And so, when she walks through the world now, she moves differently. There is no haste in her step, no pleading in her eyes. Her words, when they come, are few but full. She speaks as though every syllable has traveled through the ocean of her soul before surfacing. And those who hear her, truly hear her, know something sacred just passed between them. This is the evolution of the feminine psyche. Not louder, but deeper. Not more visible, but more real. Because she has discovered that the world does not need her to explain her light. It only needs her to be it. There comes a time when silence ripens into wisdom. It no longer feels like withholding. It becomes knowing. The woman who once explained herself to survive now walks as if each step carries an invisible temple within it. Her quiet no longer hides her light. It shapes it. In this stillness, she begins to understand something that the world rarely teaches. That most people do not listen to understand, they listen to defend. They do not seek truth, but confirmation. And to keep explaining herself to such ears was not love, it was bondage. Now she sees it clearly. The man, the friend, the world, they were never rejecting her essence. They were rejecting their own reflection in her depth. Her silence has become a mirror that reveals their fear. For the soul cannot look upon what it has not yet integrated. And so, when she stopped explaining, she stopped rescuing others from their discomfort. She allowed them to feel it, that friction between their shadow and her truth. And it was there, in that sacred discomfort, that transformation began. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." The woman who no longer explains herself has made the unconscious conscious. She has illuminated her old compulsion to be understood, and by doing so, she has stepped out of the loop of fate and into the path of destiny. This path is quiet. There are no debates here, no arguments to win. Only clarity that glows like embers, steady, warm, alive. She no longer seeks to convince, she embodies conviction. Her boundaries speak for her now. Her energy is her language. The way she enters a room is a statement of truth. The way she leaves is a sermon. Those who meet her feel something ancient stir within them, an awareness that does not require explanation. They find themselves softening, recalibrating, listening differently. Because her silence commands not submission, but presence. The man, once restless, once dismissive, begins to feel this shift in his bones. There is no argument to return to, no dialogue to conquer. Only the quiet memory of what it felt like to be seen by her. And in that memory he confronts himself. He realizes that her explanations once protected him from his own blindness. Each word she offered was a cushion for his unawareness. Her silence now forces him into the cold mirror of self-reflection. He begins to sense what Jung called the anima's withdrawal, that moment when the feminine energy retreats, not in punishment, but in purpose. It is this withdrawal that awakens the masculine to its own soul. In her absence, he begins to long for what he cannot name. It is not her voice he misses, it is the safety her energy once provided. But now he must learn to build that safety within himself. For this is the deeper mystery. The feminine silence is not rejection, it is initiation. It invites the masculine toward his own wholeness. It challenges him to meet her not with words, but with presence. Not with control, but with consciousness. The silent woman understands this. She no longer waits for him to arrive. She knows that everyone must face their own reflection in their own time. Her work now is inward, the refining of energy, the deepening of presence, the expansion of soul. She no longer explains because her life itself has become her explanation. Every choice she makes, every space she keeps sacred, every no spoken without apology. These are her new languages. Her silence has become structure. Her intuition has become compass. Her essence has become prayer. In that energy, she begins to attract differently. Those drawn to her now do not come to debate. They come to experience. They do not demand understanding. They seek resonance. And in that resonance, they too begin to awaken. For the highest form of influence is energetic, not verbal. To be around her is to remember something forgotten, the feeling of being home within oneself. Her presence begins to move through the world like fragrance, unseen yet unforgettable. People feel her before they see her. They sense the gravity of someone who does not need to be understood to be at peace. And this is where true feminine power lies, not in the loud assertion of identity, but in the quiet certainty of being. Jung believed that when the self is realized, opposites dissolve. There is no longer inner conflict between proving and resting, between explaining and knowing. The woman who stops explaining has reached this unity. She carries both softness and strength without contradiction. She no longer oscillates between extremes, she lives in center. And in that center she discovers serenity, not as an emotion, but as a frequency. A steady pulse of consciousness that says, I am. Nothing more, nothing less. The world, however, is not comfortable with this kind of woman. She unnerves systems built on compliance. Her calmness is mistaken for rebellion because it cannot be controlled. Her silence threatens the noise of mediocrity. But she does not resist this misunderstanding. She knows that truth often arrives in quiet forms, and the world takes time to listen. She lets them misinterpret her. It no longer disturbs her peace. Because she knows something most forget. Explanation is often an attempt to control perception. Silence, on the other hand, is trust. Trust that truth will reveal itself without defense. Trust that those meant to understand will feel her energy, even if they cannot yet name it. Trust that what she embodies speaks more clearly than what she could ever say. This is what Stoic wisdom calls equanimity, the grace of remaining unchanged by misunderstanding. Not indifferent, but unshaken. Not detached from love, but detached from illusion. As she walks this path, life begins to mirror her evolution. The conversations she attracts deepen. The spaces she inhabits feel safer. The relationships that could not withstand her silence quietly dissolve. And those that remain grow roots. Because silence acts as a filter. It reveals what can stand the weight of truth. Even her body begins to change. The tightness in her chest eases. Her breath flows differently, slower, fuller, wiser. It is as though her nervous system has finally exhaled after years of holding its breath. This is the somatic signature of empowerment. Not adrenaline, but peace. Not performance, but authenticity. Not the rush of approval, but the calm of self-acceptance. In the mythic sense, she has entered the temple of the wise woman. The archetype that stands beyond youth, beyond approval, beyond external validation. The wise woman does not shout to be believed. Her silence carries centuries. She understands that to speak everything is to lose the sacred. Her words now are chosen like stones placed in a river, carefully, consciously, aware of how they change the flow. And yet she is not withdrawn. She still loves, still gives, still creates. But her love is no longer performance, it is offering. Her giving is not from emptiness, it is from overflow. Her creation is not for validation, it is devotion. This is the essence of individuation, the feminine in her fullest expression. No longer reacting to the external world, but creating from the internal one. He, too, begins to feel the ripples of her transformation. Her silence that once unsettled him now draws him closer. He starts to speak less, to listen more. He begins to sense that love is not in convincing, but in being present. In her quiet, he finds his own. Her stillness becomes contagious, not by demand, but by resonance. And so the dance between them changes. Where once there was debate, there is now awareness. Where once there was explanation, there is recognition. He no longer asks her to explain herself, because he has learned to hear her without words. It is here, in this sacred space between two evolved energies, that real union is possible. Not fusion, but harmony. Not possession, but reflection. Jung called this the Konjunktio, the sacred marriage of opposites within and without, where the feminine no longer explains and the masculine no longer demands. For both have remembered their own inner completeness. And when they meet now, it is not through need, but through consciousness. Not through defense, but through devotion. They look at each other and know. The silence between them is no longer distance, it is connection. It is where truth lives. The woman who has stopped explaining herself has entered a new era of being. One where every pause, every look, every breath carries meaning. She has transcended the language of justification and entered the language of energy, essence, and knowing. Her silence has become the bridge between worlds, between mind and soul, reason and intuition, masculine and feminine. And in that space, she no longer seeks to be understood, because she finally understands herself. There comes a point when silence stops feeling like surrender and begins to feel like power. It's no longer the absence of words, it's the presence of understanding. The kind of understanding that doesn't seek to convince, only to be. She used to think silence was passive, that if she didn't explain, she would be misunderstood, forgotten, or dismissed. But now she knows, misunderstanding is not her burden to carry. It is merely the echo of another's unhealed perception. When she stopped explaining herself, she also stopped protecting others from their own shadows. Her quiet became a mirror, and mirrors, by their nature, are merciless. They do not lie. They do not flatter. They simply reflect. And in her reflection, others began to see what they had long avoided. Their projections, their wounds, their fears of inadequacy. Because when the feminine no longer fills the silence, the masculine is forced to face his own emptiness. Jung once wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." Her silence irritates him. Her calmness unsettles him, because it removes the noise that used to distract him from his own discomfort. He begins to realize, her explanations were never weakness. They were compassion. They were her way of softening the truth so he wouldn't have to face it too quickly. But now that she no longer translates herself, he must learn a new language. The language of energy, of presence, of nuance. And that language demands stillness. Stillness terrifies those who are not yet intimate with their own depths. To sit in silence with her feels like standing before a vast ocean with no map, no anchor, no compass, only reflection. Yet it is in that very reflection that growth begins. The man, if he is brave, will feel the edges of his ego soften. He will begin to sense that her silence is not rejection, it's initiation. An invitation to meet her, not through words, but through awareness. And she understands this, because she's walked through her own mirror before. She's sat in the quiet and met the parts of herself she once tried to hide. The anxious need to be liked. The fear of being too much. The ache to be chosen. Each of those fragments once drove her explanations. Each of them whispered, if they just understood you, they wouldn't leave. But she's seen through that illusion now. She's learned that those who need you to shrink in order to stay were never meant to walk beside you. And so, she lets them go, not in anger but in awareness. She knows the soul's timing cannot be rushed. Each person must awaken in their own silence. Her peace is not a performance. It is a declaration. A silent vow to honor her own depth, even when others fear it. There is something magnetic about this kind of woman. Not because she tries to draw anyone in, but because she no longer chases. The universe bends toward those who are rooted in truth. Her energy speaks where words would fail. She walks into a room and the atmosphere shifts. People lower their voices. Time slows down. Even chaos seems to hesitate before approaching her. It's not arrogance. It's coherence, the rare serenity of someone who has nothing to prove. This is what Jung referred to as the integration of the shadow, when light and dark no longer compete, but coexist. She is both softness and steel, grace and gravity. She has become whole. And in that wholeness, explanations are unnecessary. But let's be clear, this kind of silence is not coldness. It's not withdrawal. It's refinement. She still loves, still gives, still feels deeply. But she no longer bleeds for what cannot meet her halfway. She no longer translates her intuition into logic for those who do not listen. She no longer edits her truth to make others comfortable. Her boundaries are not built from fear, but from clarity. She knows that love without respect is consumption, not connection. And explaining herself to someone committed to misunderstanding her is not kindness, it's self-abandonment. Now, she chooses peace over persuasion, stillness over struggle, alignment over approval. Those who once took her explanations for granted begin to feel her absence. They notice the silence, and in that silence, they feel the weight of their own disregard. The man, especially, begins to sense something missing. He replays conversations in his head, searching for the comfort of her old reassurance. But it's gone. What remains is the echo of his own unexamined self. He begins to realize that she was never asking for too much. She was only asking him to be present. And now, in her quiet, he feels the ache of that request. It lingers like an unfinished song. This is where transformation begins, not in words, but in silence. For silence reveals what noise hides. And what it reveals cannot be unseen. He begins to awaken. Not quickly, not neatly, but inevitably. He starts to see her not as the one who needed to explain, but as the one who was always aware. Her silence becomes his mirror. And mirrors, in Jungian truth, awaken the soul. Meanwhile, her life begins to expand. Without the burden of constant explanation, her energy returns to her. What once went into defending herself now fuels her creation. Her art deepens. Her work sharpens. Her intuition becomes more precise. She notices how much lighter she feels, how the world opens up when she no longer tries to make everyone comfortable. She realizes that silence isn't emptiness. It's sacred space, the birthplace of everything true. From this space, she starts to manifest differently. People who speak the language of energy begin to find her. Conversations become deeper, slower, more nourishing. Connections no longer feel like negotiations, they feel like home. Sometimes, she still feels the old urge to explain, to soften the truth for those who can't hold it. But now she smiles when it rises, not with guilt, but with grace. She thanks that old part of herself for surviving, and then she releases it. She has learned that silence is not the absence of communication, it is the evolution of it. It speaks through vibration, expression, presence. It carries more truth than 1,000 words ever could. This is what Jung meant by individuation, the process of becoming oneself, fully and unapologetically. She has become her own center. And from that center, she moves like water, gentle, yet unstoppable. Still, the world tests her. There are moments when others misinterpret her calm as coldness, when they call her detached, distant, difficult. But she no longer flinches. She understands that those words belong to the part of them still ruled by projection. She does not argue. She simply smiles. because she knows they are not describing her. They are describing the distance between themselves and their own awareness. That is the quiet irony of the awakened feminine. She becomes the target of projection simply because she no longer carries it. Yet she remains compassionate, because she remembers what it felt like to live in that confusion, to believe that love required endless justification, that peace was found through understanding others instead of oneself. Now she knows better. Now she knows that love begins where explanation ends. Her silence has become a living sermon. Without preaching, she teaches. Without convincing, she transforms. Her energy ripples through every room she enters, a vibration that says, "Here stands a woman who no longer negotiates her truth." And that energy, it does something to the world. It rearranges it. Men stand taller. Women soften into authenticity. Even time feels slower, more deliberate, more divine. Because when the feminine returns to silence, the world remembers how to listen. The woman who stopped explaining herself has not disappeared. She has arrived. She has become what Jung would call the self made visible. A living symbol of integration. Mind, body, shadow, and spirit woven into one. And the beauty of it all is this. She doesn't even try. Her power is effortless, because it's no longer sourced from control. It's sourced from truth. Now, the silence that once felt heavy feels holy. It hums like the pause between heartbeats, a rhythm known only to those who have faced themselves and survived. Her world has changed, not because she shouted louder, but because she whispered less. Because she chose stillness over struggle. Because she realized that understanding is not a prerequisite for being loved. She simply is. And that is enough. There is a stillness that does not end when the mouth closes. It lingers, a quiet that lives inside her bones, humming softly like the last note of a sacred song. It is not withdrawal, not distance, not defeat. It is arrival. The kind of arrival that feels less like a step forward and more like a return home. For years, she mistook noise for meaning. She mistook explanation for connection. But now, she understands, noise often hides fear, and explanation is sometimes the language of the unseen wound. Her silence is not the absence of love. It is love purified of fear. She no longer explains herself because she has nothing to prove and no one to persuade. She is no longer seeking permission to exist. Her existence itself is her permission. She breathes and the world bends around that breath. This is the phase Jung described as individuation, when a soul ceases to orbit other people's expectations and begins to rotate around its own axis. She has entered that sacred gravity. And in this gravity, the world cannot move her easily. People still project onto her, as they always will. Some call her mysterious. Others, intimidating. A few, divine. But she smiles because she knows none of these are her. They are merely mirrors of perception, fragments of others' unclaimed stories reflecting back at them. The awakened feminine knows she will always be misunderstood by those who have not yet met their own silence. And so, she forgives the misunderstanding. It no longer stings. There was a time when her power frightened her. When she dimmed her light to make others feel safer. When she softened her truth until it resembled something easier to digest. But the universe does not expand through comfort. It expands through truth. And so she began the slow, sacred act of returning to herself, unfolding layer after layer, shedding identities that were never hers, whispering to her heart, "You are allowed to be whole." In Jung's language, she has integrated the animus, the inner masculine that once lived as shadow within her psyche. It no longer competes, it cooperates. It no longer dominates, it protects. Her feminine now moves with direction, her direction now breathes with grace. Together, they form a harmony that does not need to explain itself, because wholeness has no need for justification. The man who once dismissed her still feels her presence in the quiet moments. Not as guilt, but as recognition. He remembers her not through words, but through the energy that remains. The kind that lingers when a candle is blown out, and yet the scent of flame still floats through the room. He thinks of her when the world grows still. Not because she said something unforgettable, but because she no longer needed to. Her energy became the lesson. And somewhere deep within him, a mirror shatters softly. The mirror that once reflected only his own noise. He begins to understand what she embodied. That silence is not absence. It is awareness. It is what remains when illusion dissolves. The world, too, feels her change. Her friends notice it first, the way she listens differently now, the way her laughter seems grounded in something ancient. Her presence no longer rushes to fill the space. It expands into it. People come to her not for validation, but for resonance. Even strangers sense it, the rare gravity of someone who has faced herself and survived. She does not speak often, but when she does, her words feel earned. They come from depth, not defense. From peace, not performance. This is the quiet majesty of an integrated woman. Her silence no longer hides her, it reveals her. It reveals the kind of strength that doesn't need to dominate, because it already is. Stillness becomes her teacher. Through it, she learns the difference between reaction and response, between connection and attachment, between love and self-abandonment. She learns that love without awareness becomes possession, that empathy without boundaries becomes self-erasure. That explanation, repeated too often, becomes a cage. So now she moves like a tide, giving, retreating, flowing, always whole. No longer trying to convince the shore that her rhythm makes sense. She simply moves as she is moved. And in this silence, she begins to see the deeper architecture of existence. She notices that the sun never explains why it rises, that the moon never defends its changing face, that flowers bloom without apology, and rivers carve through stone without asking permission. Everything in nature expresses truth without justification. And she, too, is nature. She belongs to that same divine rhythm. Her silence is not rebellion, it is remembrance. It is the sound of aligning with the order of things. People often mistake her calm for control, but it is something subtler than that. It is surrender, not the kind that bows down, but the kind that rises above. She no longer fights to be seen. She sees herself. She no longer begs to be understood. She understands. And in that inner seeing, the need for outer validation dissolves. That's the secret of the silent feminine. Her power multiplies the moment she stops explaining where it comes from. Jung once said that, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. She has taken that privilege seriously. Her silence has become a ceremony of becoming. Each breath, a prayer of authenticity. Each quiet choice, a brushstroke of self-respect. When she stopped explaining herself, the universe began explaining her instead. Opportunities arrived without chase. Love appeared without performance. Peace unfolded without permission. This is the paradox of energy. When you stop seeking, you begin to attract. When you stop explaining, you begin to embody. There's a sacred magnetism in her now. Not loud. Not visible to everyone. But those tuned to truth feel it instantly. They sense it in her presence, the way she listens without needing to fix. The way she speaks only when the silence has ripened enough to birth meaning. She has become the kind of woman who cannot be forgotten. Not because she clings, but because she anchors. Her energy lingers like a temple long after the worshippers have gone home. Her silence echoes through others, not as absence, but as awakening. This is what happens when the feminine reclaims her self-trust. She becomes less reactive, more radiant. Less performative, more present. She becomes a mirror through which others meet their own depth, or their own resistance to it. Men who once sought control feel both drawn and disarmed. Women who once sought approval feel both challenged and inspired. Children, animals, strangers, all sense it instinctively. The quiet authority of one who has integrated light and shadow. Her silence doesn't demand attention, it commands it. Not through ego, but through essence. There are moments, of course, when she falters. When old wounds whisper, they won't understand you unless you explain. But she has learned to smile at those ghosts. She touches them gently and says, "We are safe now." And just like that, the echo fades. She has become her own mother, her own protector, her own witness. No longer waiting for anyone else to validate her worth. Her self-understanding is the ground beneath her feet. And the world can shift, quake, even fall apart, but she remains centered. This is what Jung called the self, the archetype of totality, the meeting point of all opposites. She has become the still point around which the wheel of her life turns. At night, when the world is quiet, she sometimes sits by the window and watches the moonlight move across her floor. She doesn't think. She doesn't explain. She simply is. And in that being, the entire universe seems to exhale through her. The stars do not ask her to justify her brightness. The wind does not question her direction. Even time seems to pause, as if honoring the rhythm she now embodies. In that silence, something whispers, not from outside but from within. You have become the silence you once feared. The next morning, she wakes with ease. She moves slower now, not because she is tired, but because she no longer rushes toward what is already hers. The world meets her in this rhythm. People speak softer, moments stretch longer, and even chaos seems to bend respectfully around her calm. She has become the teacher she once searched for. Not through speeches, not through argument, but through the quiet, consistent frequency of truth. And this, perhaps, is the final secret. When a woman stops explaining herself, she doesn't lose her voice, she finds it. Her silence becomes her language. Her presence becomes her statement. Her stillness becomes her art. The woman who once sought to be understood has become understanding itself. The one who tried to be heard has become the echo that shapes the room. And the world, though it may not always grasp her fully, will never forget her. Because she has transcended explanation and entered the realm of embodiment. The story of her silence is not the story of withdrawal. It is the story of return, to self, to center, to source. For in a world obsessed with noise, the woman who chooses quiet becomes a revolution. She does not need to announce her worth. Her worth announces her. She does not need to prove her power. Her power breathes through her stillness. And as she walks away, from arguments, from validation, from misunderstanding, the earth seems to tremble slightly beneath her feet. Not in fear, but in recognition. For the universe knows what she has become. She has become the silence between heartbeats, the moment before dawn, the truth that no longer needs to explain itself.